Welcome, everyone. My name is Patricia Kranz. I'm the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. And we're delighted tonight to have another event in our series of award winners having a conversation with the head judges of that award. And tonight, we're talking to the winners of the Lowell Thomas Award. And the winning team is from NPR's Rough Translation podcast. And participating in it is Greg Warner, Karen Duffin and Sebastian Meyer. Ann Cooper, Professor Emerita of the Columbia Journalism School, was the head judge, and she will interview them. And the winning piece of work was called The Search, a two-part podcast. And it was a very moving story about a disappearance of a Kurdish photojournalist. And we're lucky tonight we can hear the backstory of how they got the story. So the panelists will talk for approximately half an hour, and then we can take questions. At any time, you can submit your question by raising your hand in the Zoom box or using the Q&A. And when the time comes, we can take them in order and unmute you, and you can ask it yourself. If you prefer to just have somebody read it, put it in the chat box, and then Anne or one of us will read it. So now I'm delighted to turn it over to Anne. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Patricia, and thanks very much for Overseas Press Club for organizing these discussions, which really give us a chance to hear much more from the journalists who get these annual awards. So I don't know if that's a silver lining of pandemic, but there it is. Take it or leave it. I want to recognize the four other judges who worked on this award. Ann Garrels, one of my longtime colleagues at NPR.
Now it's just my image, but you, all three of you walked back.
Ann Garrels of NPR, longtime foreign correspondent. Suzanne Marmion, who's the news director at KPBS, which is both public radio and public TV in San Diego. Shandukani Maladze is executive producer of podcasts for the Children's Radio Foundation in Johannesburg, South Africa, and Chris Livesay, who is CBS News Rome correspondent. So there were five of us who listened to just amazing broadcasts and came up with The Search as really the one that just grabbed us and told us this incredible story that has some kind of universal themes in it, but also is a very specific story about a single person. This appeared on Rough Translation, which is a podcast that says it takes you to far off places that hit close to home. In this case, the far off place is Iraq, specifically the Kurdish territories of Iraq. And the main character is a young man, Kamaran Najm. He becomes a war photographer when conflict comes to Iraq. And, you know, among the kind of big themes that are explored in this, in the two parts are war, obviously, journalism, you know, how journalism covers war, and also family discord. And that starts pretty quickly once Kamaran becomes a photographer, because his parents kind of had some other thoughts about what he might do as a career, but he's very committed. He meets a lot of foreign correspondents, including Sebastian Meyer. He opens a photo agency, Iraq's first photo agency, and his idea is to train other photographers, not necessarily as war photographers, but he wants a photo agency that tells more than war stories about Iraq. My country is about more than Iraq. Let's show that to the world. Sebastian became a partner in the photo agency. And then the kind of pivotal event in this story actually puts Kamaran back out in the field as a war photographer. ISIS has come to Iraq, and a Kurdish military official calls him and says, we are about to launch an attack against ISIS. You are welcome to come along if you want to cover it. So Kamaran goes, he takes his pictures. He is shot during this battle. He's right there on the front line. Lots of confusion. You do hear some audio of that, amazing audio in the piece. And then, you know, things get really hairy. The shooting continues. The Kurdish military retreats, and Kamaran's body is left there. They go back, they report that the photographer was with them and he was killed. And that is reported on Kurdish media. So the family, all of Kamaran's friends hear that, you know, he has died while being out there covering this story. The next day, Sebastian and one of Kamaran's brothers go in search of the body. And they're, you know, they are out looking around trying to figure out, you know, where it might be. And suddenly a phone call comes through to one of the people with them. And Sebastian, that phone call is such a pivotal moment, also an incredible piece of audio. So tell us about that. This is a photo from that moment.
Yeah, so to, you know, to set the scene before the phone call, we had all been told that Kamaran had been killed. The Kurdish media was reporting it. The Peshmerga, the Kurdish army, their official report was that he was dead. So the day after, about 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, myself, 2 of Kamaran's brothers and a couple friends drove to Kirkuk to coordinate with the local police to figure out how we could get into the area where the battle had been the previous day, how we could access no man's land and retrieve Kamaran's body, which had been left behind. And while we were standing there, this is exactly where we were standing in this photograph. Kamaran called from captivity. Birwa, his best friend from childhood, got the phone call because it was one of the few phone numbers Kamaran had memorized. And he said, "It's me, Kamaran." And it was this sort of unbelievable. I struggle to find the words that can really convey how incredible it was, because we were all told and we all believed, and all the eyewitnesses said that Kamaran had been shot and he died. And it was, you know, this odd Lazarus moment where he came back to life. I had my iPhone on me, so I'll probably talk about this later on, but I was in this very odd role. I lived and worked in Iraq, in the Kurdish region, but covered the region as a journalist. But as soon as this happened, I stopped being a journalist. I was Kamaran's friend, and I was there not as a journalist. I was there to try to rescue him, or at least to retrieve his body, until we got the phone call. But there's nothing I could do in that moment. So that's why I reached in my pocket and pulled out my iPhone and snapped this picture and snapped a little bit of video as well, because it was just an instinct. I didn't know what else to do. And in fact, I had my notebook there to record, again, not for any journalistic purposes, but I knew that tensions were going to be running very high, and my presence there was best served as someone to just record what was going on. So that's how we ended up with this photograph. And in terms of what happened next is, again, as I said, we'd gone there to retrieve his body. Kamaran was dead, and now we had been instantaneously thrown into a different situation where now Kamaran was a hostage, and he was an ISIS hostage. And ISIS had been around long enough, especially in Syria, that we knew what happened to ISIS hostages. So it was both an incredibly uplifting moment that suddenly my best friend was alive, but then immediately it sunk in that it was a terrifying situation, because now he was an ISIS hostage.
am I muted here? Okay, I think it's Gregory Warner who says in the within the story that if Kamaran had been an American journalist, you know, the U.S. government would have stepped in. There would have been, you know, advice, investigation, diplomatic efforts, whatever, on behalf of this journalist. But he wasn't. And in fact, most of the journalists who are kidnapped are local journalists like Kamaran. And so, you know, it ends up being really up to you, Sebastian, and the other friends and the family to conduct this search. And one of the things that you did, this is, I think this photo is inside the photo agency, which became a command center. And you see the whiteboard on there. There's, when I looked at some of these photos, it made me think about, you know, a detective story where they have the whiteboard and, you know, the lines drawn and the little bits of paper and the photos and everything stuck up. This became a huge search. You had a big spreadsheet and someone had advised you put everything in there, every tip that you get. And there were all kinds of tips. Some people contradicted each other. Some wanted money for, you know, we've got information, but pay us some money. And, you know, every lead is being followed up. And it is just, you know, an all-consuming task. As you say, you know, that then became what you were doing while you were there. Somewhere along the way, there's a rift between the friends and the family who, you know, had started out very united in this search. But that develops, and so now things are going kind of on two different tracks. And then Sebastian, you get called back to New York, where you meet Karen Duffin. And Karen, I'd like to ask you to talk about how you came together, how you first heard about this story, and how you decided to move forward with it as a podcast.
Yeah, I met Sebastian on a listserv, for a radio listserv. He is a photographer, but hadn't done audio work before, and he just reached out about actually a different story that he wanted to work on, and it sounded interesting, and I offered to help. And it was probably about a year and a half, right, Sebastian, into since the kidnapping, and we became friends, and I watched as a friend for a bit, and then just said, you know, we should start recording, you know, as you're going through this process. And he had already been recording some. And so about a year and a half after the kidnapping, we started doing interviews. And at the time when I first met Sebastian, he was pretty confident that Kamaran was still alive. And so it was a process of, you know, over the next about 2.5 years of watching, you know, him follow different leads and the emotional process of that and the split in the family. And it just became clear that it was this really human, but this like human scale story, but that spoke to so many different themes. And it just, yeah, it was no question that it would be a beautiful story and honestly a tribute to Kamaran and the work that he had done.
At what point, Gregory Warner, does rough translation come into this? And I wondered, as I was thinking about this, you know, rough translation says it tells stories of far off places that hit close to home. I'm sure that close to home means more than just one of the characters. Sebastian is from New York. How did this fit into rough translation?
No, I appreciate the question. I mean, close to home, you know, we've all been, I think, foreign overseas correspondents here, and you know, that's the typical idea of being a correspondent. You find the American character, the American link, right? And so in some sense, rough translation exists to get away from that. So the close to home aspect for me, well, first of all, as a radio person, the tape that Sebastian and Karen were bringing is just, we couldn't get that anywhere. I mean, the intimacy of the tape, as you referred to in your introduction, it just brings you into places that you can't imagine being. And so it gets into your heart. But also I think the close to home aspect was to think about how we could make this story of this Iraqi journalist feel like it was your friend. I mean, he was your friend because he's a friend of Sebastian. He's the brother of Ahmed. And, you know, we thought a lot about if this were a profile of a Western journalist who went missing, you would learn a lot about their life and not just about their disappearance. And so in some ways, the hardest, the part of the piece that took the longest, most thinking was the first, I guess, around 16 minutes or so when we're building the story of who he was. And trying to make people walk through the shoes of this guy. I mean, Kamaran, his aesthetic as a war correspondent was to not just cover war, and so we wanted to do tribute to that. But when you're talking about him and making him feel real, there's all kinds of translations that you're having to do sort of along the way. Even when we introduce Ahmed, his brother, even sort of introducing the fact that Ahmed doesn't like to be celebrating his birthday, and the birthday party thing is a big part of the first 16 minutes. And you know, having to do that kind of translation work that we wouldn't have had to do for an Iraqi audience. So I think just kind of the close to home for me in rough translation in general is to try to walk in the shoes of somebody else and to feel like this is not a foreign story. This is a story that's happening right here.
Okay. I want to ask also about those two amazing pieces of tape. The first one is, and I don't know, Sebastian, maybe you know how this was actually being recorded when Kamaran is at the front, and somebody, I think maybe Karen's narrating then, talks about bullets whizzing, and you literally hear, I'm not sure I've heard that in real tape before, that whiz of the bullets. How was he recording that, and how did that get recovered?
It's a great question. So Kamaran went to the front line with a tape recorder, with an audio recorder in his bag, and after he was shot, he was wounded. The Peshmerga put him in the back of a pickup truck with his bag, with his camera, and just before, you know, they were going to take his body off the battlefield. He was going to be rescued, but just at that moment, ISIS spotted them and started firing right at the pickup truck. And the driver slammed his foot on the gas, and they hadn't put the tailgate up. And Kamaran rolled out the back of the pickup truck, but his bag and his camera remained in the pickup truck. So that's how his equipment was rescued, but Kamaran wasn't. And so the following day, the day after we went to Kirkuk to retrieve his body, and we found out that he was alive, we then discovered that his equipment, his camera and his audio recorder, were being held by the Peshmerga. And so we went and picked it up and retrieved it.
Mm-hmm. And there was no problem getting that from them?
No, not at all. I mean, because I was with Ahmed, I was with his brother, and so the Peshmerga said, you know, this belongs to Kamaran, this belongs to his family. Yeah. So that, yeah, in terms of collecting audio, you know, again, I talked about it earlier, but it was a very odd role for me. You know, it's not an odd role. For the first 9 months, maybe a year, I'd say, or even year and a half, I had no role as a journalist in this. This was not, I wasn't reporting this story. I was trying to rescue Kamaran. And in fact, I spent a huge amount of my time trying to enforce a media blackout about the story, because Kamaran had worked for the Washington Post and Der Spiegel in Germany. There was interest in publishing stories about him. And so we had to work very hard to make sure that no one reported on him because he was a hostage. You don't want that to be in the news because you lose control of any sort of information and story, and ISIS might be able to use it to their advantage and against you. So I'd spent a lot of time, in fact, trying to stop people reporting on what had happened. When it came time to do the story with rough translation, my role then switched to then being a journalist. So my job at that point was then to report on the story, to collect this audio. And assume the other piece of tape you were going to ask about was his call from captivity.
Right.
And that was just in total and utter piece of luck that Birwa, his best friend from growing up, had espionage aspirations. Like he wanted to be a CIA agent when he was younger. And so he had an app on his phone that recorded all his phone calls. And it's just by chance that smartphones had been invented and that he downloaded that app and that he had that phone call recorded. So we were able to get that phone call. There are actually no other phone calls from Kamaran, but there are there's other recordings from that day that that Birwa took that we were able to use to inform a lot of our background reporting about what actually was transpiring. So it was very useful.
Great. So there's a story about Kamaran that's really key to it's what he says was the inspiration for starting the photo agency. And I think it raises a really interesting journalistic question that, I'd like to ask to all of you if you have thoughts. He had been out taking pictures, I can't remember where it was, but of a bombing, aftermath of a bombing, comes back, files his pictures, and I don't know to what newsroom it was, but then he talks to the editor who got his photos, who said, well, actually there was a bigger bomb somewhere else today, so we're going to run those pictures instead. And Kamaran, I think we hear his voice in the story from a video saying that that's the moment that he kind of realized, this photography is making money off of the killing of people, and he wants to do something different because that's not the full story of Iraq. And that's one of those kind of cynical journalistic moments. We're not going to use your pictures because there was a bigger bombing today. Ugh. I mean, how does that make you feel when you hear that?
I'll just start off and then I'll let Karen and Gregory tell their versions. But that story, Kamaran was one of the first memorable stories that Kamaran told me when we first met in 2008. And this is when he was just starting to think about this photo agency and what it was about. In fact, it's even more cynical than that, because in the way photojournalism worked with Iraqi stringers is the wire agencies paid you directly for the photograph. So Kamaran had gone to Kirkuk to photograph this car bomb, and then he was called his editor to say, I've got these pictures. And the editor said, I'm not going to buy the photographs because there's a bigger bomb in Mosul, and those are the pictures I'm going to buy. So it wasn't even that Kamaran took the pictures on assignment. He was taking the pictures on spec, and couldn't even get paid to do the work because there was something more atrocious that had happened at the same time somewhere else in the country. But yes, that definitely was, and that was very informative. It was a very, very meaningful moment to me to then help him or co-found this photo agency together, because as an American news consumer, the only pictures I'd ever seen of Iraq were of violence. And the only pictures I'd ever seen of Iraq, to be honest, were taken by American, European, South African, Japanese photographers. I didn't see many pictures of, by Iraqi photographers. And Kamaran's friends, photojournalist friends, I met them when I first went in 2008. And the pictures that they showed me that they were taking showed a completely different side to Iraq. And I was like, oh, and this is way before journalism was talking about representation. It was just very clear. A naive American shows up and is like, oh wait, it doesn't look like that. There's so much more going on here. And so that's what inspired me, along with Kamaran's ridiculous charisma, to stop my entire life, move to Iraq, and help them start a photo agency.
I mean, just to piggyback on that, I mean, yeah, that moment that Kamaran has, of course, resonates with anybody who has had to make news overseas. And I mean, that I will just say that it came up also when we were thinking about this story and not making it just about kidnapping, actually not making it just about the dark things. I mean, we wanted to emphasize friendship and what it means, how we move on, and what we have to do in moments. So bringing out those themes was very important. But also, I will say that in terms of, it's something that we think about a lot in Rough Translation. What is newsworthy overseas? And in some ways, what we set up here with the podcast, and that's very explicitly not about the news, but comes in a different perspective, kind of does allow us, I think, to try to continue that kind of work of not making it just about the headline, if the headline's kind of sad.
Karen, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to reduce people, especially people far away, to the most sensational thing about them. Even I did a story last week that had to do with race, and the people who were not as close to the story were trying to reduce her to a moment in her childhood when she desegregated schools. And it actually wasn't the most significant thing about her. And so there's a push anytime you make a story where something sensational happens to a person, to make them, to just distill it down to that thing. But to the point of the reason why Gregory started the podcast is, you know, having stories hit close to home means letting people be all the things that they are, you know, not just the most sensational thing that they are. And I think that's how, yeah, we've worked really hard to try to make him a person that you related to before you get to the kidnapping. And it was really important to us that be a big part of it.
Yeah. Okay, so we are going to do some Q&A. So if anybody does have questions, either, I guess, raise your hand, or you can put your question in chat. And we'll do that in a couple of minutes. But Karen, I think you narrate a part of the story where Sebastian is trying to come to grips with this loss. This is now a few years, I think, into the kidnapping and no resolution. And he lands on a definition of something called ambiguous loss. And I was thinking, I think you point out, or the story points out, you know, how many thousands, tens of thousands of people in Iraq have had these kinds of losses. And I wondered, talk about that. What does that mean, ambiguous loss, and how does it affect people, you know, both individually, but also a country, to have so many people in this kind of state of limbo?
I'll talk about it for a second, and then I'll hand it to Sebastian, because he lived this, but I watched him live it as a friend and as the person who was kind of co-reporting it with him. I mean, I think that the death of someone you love is always a difficult thing, but there's a difference between being able to have some kind of closure and having and not having that. I don't even know how better to say it, but I also watched Sebastian lose other people that he loved in his life, that he knew all the facts of their passing. And it just, even as an observer, it was just a very different experience. And I think even in, this may be a terrible analogy, but even in a pandemic where like there's just this extended forever and ever uncertainty, all of us are feeling the tiniest version of that, which is just like, I feel a lot of grief and loss, and I'm not exactly sure how to pin that down. But Sebastian, obviously you lived this, and you'll, it's a hard thing to even explain, I think, even as someone who lived it. But yeah, Sebastian, if you have thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. This was, I think, at one point gonna make it into the edit, but didn't, when I think Gregory asked me how to, because I found Ambiguous Loss, the term, and the Pauline Boss, who is the family therapist who coined the term. Gregory asked me, "How did you find the term?" And the reality is, I literally, at a point of desperation, Googled what I was feeling. I couldn't remember exactly what the search terms were, but I literally just put into Google what I was feeling, and after a few clicks, it literally came back to me, oh, Ambiguous Loss, and it's a book and a concept by Pauline Boss. And succinctly, it's loss without closure. And it can be what I experienced in losing Kamaran, which is, someone's kidnapped and they don't come back. But it could be terminal illness where someone is dying, but they're almost dead, but they're not, and it continues for a very long time. It can be dementia, where somebody is physically present, but not mentally present. It can be adoption. It can be, and I think, I'm sure Pauline Boss is probably writing on how the pandemic is, Karen doesn't even need to tiptoe around it. I think the pandemic is 100%, we're all living some version of it. So yeah, that's how I came up with the term. What was the second part of the question? Oh, and unmute yourself.
Yeah. It was whether the country, how would a country?
Right. So about how it affected the country. So just to give you the numbers, ICMP, which is the International Committee on Missing Persons, which was formed after the Balkan Wars, they estimate that since the 1980s, over 1 million Iraqis have gone missing and have not been found, which means that's 1 million families, 1 million friends, maybe more than 1 million friends, who don't know where their loved one has gone. And they think that in and of itself, just that, having so many people missing loved ones, is itself a blockage of forming civil society in Iraq today.
There's a really beautiful poem that almost made it into the story but didn't, that if you buy Sebastian's book, you can read. He did a beautiful photo book about this, and it's a really moving poem by a Kurdish poet who says, if you come to my country and you want to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, I'm sure I'm doing this injustice, but essentially, if you want to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, you could lay it at any rock, at any mosque, at any home, literally, and it says under any yard of sky, I think is what it says, that there's so much ambiguous loss in the country, and so much loss overall, that if you wanted to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Kurdistan, you could lay it anywhere. And it's just a beautiful representation of this particular kind of heartbreak.
One of those many choices you have to make where you have something incredible and it doesn't quite make it in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that.
Yeah. So
we interviewed, so I was just going to quickly just mention, we interviewed a Kenyan academic for a piece that we did more recently about the emerging legacy of George Floyd. And she mentioned about sort of in a country where so many people, where police violence is so common, we need to learn to grieve for one person. And this balance, I think, between, we're going to focus on this one person, even though we understand that so many have died. It's just sort of an exercise, I think, in allowing us, or even Ahmed talks about sort of allowing himself to feel his grief, and something important to us.
Right. So Chad, I don't see anything in chat. Do you have questions somewhere? Or?
I think we just had a question come in.
Okay.
Do you see that?
Yes.
Yep. Great.
Okay. From Marianne McCune, who also actually, I don't know what Marianne did on this podcast, except that she was one of the key people, right?
She is an extraordinary editor, is what she is, and was
Okay.
for this story. Yeah.
Okay, so Karen, this is for you. Marianne says, I would love to hear you talk about your role in this story. You're telling a story via two people to whom the story happened. They're both journalists, so they could be telling the story themselves. I wonder how you thought about your job. And to be clear, the reason I ask is because I'm an avid admirer of your ability to listen and think about and tell stories in general, and this one in particular.
Thank you, Marianne. The feelings are so mutual. Yeah, Sebastian and I talked about this a lot. It wasn't a given that I would be involved with the story at all. And I think what it came down to, and the reason why I became involved at all, like at first I was kind of just encouraging Sebastian to record and to tell the story as his friend. But as we started doing interviews just to capture, like each time something would happen, we would sit down and do an interview. I think that as we started doing interviews, it became clear to me as a storyteller that it might be easier for Sebastian to like stumbly express himself to me than to have to find the exact right words to say it. Because like when you write the script, you have to like figure out the most perfect way to explain ambiguous loss. But if we're talking about it in conversation, it can be stumbly, it can be messy, it can be imprecise, it can be more emotional. And it felt like it might be a much, just like a more impactful story if he didn't have to be like the, you know, polished narrator of it. And I mean, I mostly wanted to get out of the way of it and just help him like draw out what he was experiencing, because it's a really difficult thing to explain and to have to like navigate the, I mean, it was really painful just as an observer to watch the highs and lows of it, and to then have to put those in the exact right words just seemed like it wouldn't be as impactful. But I don't know, Sebastian, if that's how you remember it.
No, that's exactly how I remember it. And then there's something else, that there's the second aspect to it, which is when we had initially talked about it, me doing the story and you advising me, is Ahmed was not going to be such a large part, and that really comes down to Gregory and Marianne and the whole team at Rough Translation, where Ahmed was a huge character in the story. I mean, he's also a very close friend of mine. But it never occurred to me to have his voice so prominent, and it made the story, as far as I'm concerned. It through Ahmed, you get to know Kamaran in ways that I couldn't have done. And Ahmed is such a beautiful individual and speaks, and is also charismatic and hilarious, and that was because of that the story ended up, that Rough Translation produced the story.
So I'm going to go to a couple of other questions here. One from Amy Yee. There's a lot of pushback in journalism about representation and misrepresentation and who gets to tell which stories. Do you think that editors and management will change their ways? Will they be more open to authentic, complex stories instead of oversimplified and sensational ones? I hear from many people, including readers, that they don't want those sensational stories, yet editors seem to think they do, even though they're far from what's happening on the ground, sitting safely in their offices in New York or DC or wherever. Thank you.
I can speak to this as just as a white girl named Karen who did a story about race last week with this woman, an African-American economist, and she was researching innovation, and the way she came to her understanding of the problem, this economic problem, was mostly because of her experience in Russia, studying in Russia, and some of her experience with desegregating schools as a kid. And we got a lot of push to like just be like, oh, Russia's too complicated, like let's just go to the thing, because the story or the paper she wrote was about race. And I think by far, in my experience, the best way to get stories that are pitched, that are nuanced and that are told with nuance, is to have people in the room with that sort of lived experience. There's just a huge difference in what stories come in and how they're told. If you do happen to be telling a story about someone with a different lived experience, I think it's on you as a reporter to be a really, really, really great listener. And to really, so that my co-host and I just really heard her not talk about desegregation and mostly talk about Russia. And so we really, really fought with our editors to like, we won't do it. We won't reduce her to just that one thing because it's not actually the true story of her. So I think you have to be really attuned to the subtleties of what they're trying to tell you if it's not your lived experience, and then is where you can be getting gut checks. But I mean, the number one best way to do this is to have people in the room who've had that experience. There's just no real substitute for that.
Yeah, I'll just second that and say that on Rough Translation, we've learned, and when we do make a policy of sort of any time we're talking about any place, we're playing it for people from that place, and making time to hear that feedback, because that's just so important to get that nuance and to understand how it's going to be heard.
Sebastian, any thoughts as a photographer, how this plays out
I
for
mean,
you?
pick your editors well. It's as a freelancer, it's hard because you're subject to where you're, to selling your story. But if you want to do great nuanced work, find organizations and editors who do great nuanced work. And Rough Translation would be top of the list. And just, I don't know I think I told Karen and Gregory this, but to your question, or to your point, Gregory, about what would people think from the country, Kurdish Iraqis are obsessed with this story. And I get emails still being like, when is Hollywood gonna make this movie? I get it like at least, it used to be 5 times a day. Now it's like once every other month. Someone's like, I want to see this in a movie form. It's amazing.
And what's the answer?
Once the pandemic's over, I'll talk to some people.
Okay. But I mean, has anybody ever approached you about it becoming a movie?
No, some documentary film company approached me to make a documentary about it, but it didn't. It was not right. It wasn't a good fit.
Okay. Sebastian, here's a question for you. How did you compare the kind of impact how'd you compare the kind of impact that photos could make compared with the impact of the audio? And has it made you think about the way you need to report and tell stories from here?
I mean, that is a great question. Every medium has their own strengths and weaknesses. One of the reasons that I thought radio to begin with is that I had audio, right? I had the audio of Kamaran from the front line when he was shot, and I had the audio of the phone call. So it made sense to me that radio would be the way to do it. Secondary to that, and I was a huge fan of narrative radio, independent, just as a consumer, not as a producer of it, but as a consumer. I mean, I started listening to This American Life when I was a sophomore in college, and then the whole podcast revolution. And I remember when Rough Translation started. I remember their first season blew my mind. I think each medium has their strength. And in this particular situation, the photographs were not going to be the way to tell the story. And yeah, I'll just leave it there for that. And if there's a follow-up question, we can talk about it.
Okay. There was a follow-up comment from Amy Yee who liked your answers and said, I hope editors are listening. I don't know if they are or not, but Sebastian, I mentioned early on about the rift, the division between the family and the friends, and how, things went in not exactly 2 different directions, but, you weren't talking to each other. Ahmed was a bit of a go-between, but, and eventually you found out what that was all about. Can you talk about that? And because you thought it was sort of one thing, right? Or there were certain reasons, and then you learned it was different.
So we had a little bit of help at the very beginning, just a little bit of assistance. And one of the media organization out of the Netherlands was able to put us in touch with a British hostage negotiator who would just advise us for a couple of months on how to run things. And he was just a great resource in terms of just advice on what to do. He wasn't going to be doing any negotiating on our behalf, but he was just more the background advisor. And one of the first things he said to me, is make sure that you as non-family, you guys run the show, and that the family are kept separate. They have a representative who you report to, and then they report to the family, because the amount of stress and anxiety and tension is going to make it very difficult to work with the family. And what happened in this case is that Kamaran's family completely understandably wanted to take control. We became the group of friends. We had resources that they didn't. Iraqi, very talented Iraqi journalists who had contacts throughout the whole country, had contacts within ISIS, had contacts within top military leadership. We could access things that the family couldn't. So we started off working together, and we ended up falling out, and for a very long time working against each other and undermining each other. And that anger and resentment that I felt towards the family, who did some very aggressive, very nasty things to me and to Kamaran's fiance and to Ahmed as well, that stayed with me as a solid, unmovable thought for many, many years. And it was actually the last bit of reporting I did for the story, as I went back to Iraq to interview Kamaran's one of his older brothers, who was sort of the head of the family unit that was very much against us. And it was in interviewing him and then talking to Karen and Gregory about it on tape afterwards, I realized that, not I realized, but I saw for the first time what it must have been like from their perspective to go through this and to have people who are not their family working on it. And I also saw in a much deeper way the risks that they were taking and what they were fearful of. I hadn't appreciated just what level of risk they were taking. So I got to, in reporting the story, actually have a personal moment of understanding their side.
Yeah. And that older brother, I think you say in the piece, or somebody says in the piece, he's the only one who still believes that, or at least at the time of the broadcast, the only one who still believed that Kamaran was alive?
Yes. Yeah, Najat is very, very religious, and his faith has really been able to help him keep this positive outlook that Kamaran's still alive. But neither I nor Ahmed believe that Kamaran's still alive. I don't know about he has many, many, many brothers. I don't know what they all think. Our relationship is, it's better that we're not in touch with each other.
Yeah. Are there any, I don't remember when this ran. This story aired in 2019, right?
Yep, in June of 2019.
June, okay. So a year ago. Has anything happened since? Is there any news? Do people still get tips? Is anybody still actively investigating?
No one is actually actively investigating to find Kamaran alive. Ahmed for a while was going to different exhumations of mass graves to try to figure out if Kamaran's remains were there. But unfortunately, with the resurgence of ISIS and ISIS-style groups in Iraq, the area where we think Kamaran's body is most likely is now controlled by these resurgent ISIS groups, and it's way too dangerous to even go there.
And on what basis do you think it is in that place? I mean, what led you to that?
Basically, because we never received proof of life after that first phone call. We had tips that took us all over northern Iraq. So we were from Kirkuk to Hawija to Mosul. We even heard tips that he was in Syria. You know, we moved around a lot, but were never able to get one single piece of like a real proof of life, a video, a photograph, anything. So we, with some advice, realized that most likely Kamaran died very, very early on in his captivity. And if he died very early on in his captivity, we think we know the area where he died. But even if the area were safe, to be perfectly honest, and we could go there, it would still be, you know, a needle in a haystack in terms of locating his remains.
So let me go back to that thought about, you know, if this was an American journalist, you'd have, you know, investigation, you'd have diplomatic efforts, et cetera. And there's, I think in the story, you talk about there's a military commander who does call back to that number that you guys got the phone call on, and that's it. That's all that ever happened, you know, from the official side of Iraq. Were you, was the family trying to get the government to do anything? I mean, what sort of response was there?
So that, when Kamaran called from captivity, it was obviously a surprise to us. We thought he was dead. So because Bidwa had recorded the phone call, we were able to take that recording straight to the commander and say, look, Kamaran's alive. He initially said, no, he's not. I was there. I was next to him. He died. He bled out in front of me. And so Bidwa played him the recording, and he goes, oh. And at that very moment, because Kamaran only called maybe 20 minutes earlier, they had the phone number of Kamaran's captors who wanted to speak to the Kurdish commander. You know, they wanted to have, they had something of his, and so they had a strong negotiating stand. But he botched the negotiation because he's been a Peshmerga his whole life and knows how to fight and does not know how to negotiate. And so it was a botched negotiation. And then that phone number was then turned off and never turned back on again. We tried calling that number, you know, multiple times the first day, multiple times the second day. And then as time went on, we call it once a week or once a day, once a week, once a month. We did coordinate a lot with Kurdish intelligence, who had spies inside of ISIS areas, but they were never able to locate or give us any useful intelligence on where Kamaran was. So there were efforts, and the family definitely pushed for that, but it came to nothing. Nothing useful came out of it.
We have, I think, just a couple of minutes left here. I don't see any questions, but if anybody does want to chime in, hit the Q&A or chat button and let us know. And I just wanted to ask each of you, if you have a particular takeaway from this story, and you know, about journalism, about war, about anything. I mean, what you worked on this for literally years, and I just wonder, what do you know, what did it change about the way you think or the way you see the world, if anything?
There's something that Kamaran said. It's a strange thing to report on someone for so long that I've never met. And it wasn't until the very end that when we started really putting it together, that I started hearing the recordings of Kamaran, and then started, you know, he became more of a person to me, right? And so there are things about him. I just think that I would really enjoy him. He has a free spirit that I think I would enjoy. But there's something that he said that I think about a lot, and I've been thinking about it a lot during the pandemic. He said to Ahmed, break the rules, make new rules, but better than the last ones. And that's not particularly a journalistic thing that I learned from him, but that is something, or from making the story, but that's something I think about a lot. That he was, I mean, he really gave up kind of everything. Even before he was kidnapped, he had given up pretty much everything that was familiar to him to chase something that he believed in. I mean, he was going against everybody in his life that he loved. And so I don't know, I take a lot from his courage, honestly, and well before the kidnapping, and I think about that a lot.
You know, being on this call, it just reminds me how great it is to work with these people. And so thank you for organizing this, because it really, I mean, when perspective shifts or something we talk about all the time at Rough Translation, but to hear Sebastian talk very movingly about how he was interested in watching his perspective rebalanced, in a sense, with the family's perspective and with people that were not him. And in some sense, I mean, working on this story was always an exercise in getting somebody else, you know, I think especially when a story is so important to, well, it's obviously so incredibly important to Sebastian, it came to be incredibly important to Karen. So I would say that while I learned many lessons from Kamaran, in some sense, the lessons I took away from it were how you work with people who have so much invested in a story and care about it so much, and we need to do such a good job with it. And yet, in some sense, to do that is to let go of your own view on what it means and what it says. And so you have to go off and find some other person that you don't even agree with and hear what they have to say. And you know, that was an incredible journey that we took with these reporters. So, you know, I was incredibly grateful.
Sebastian?
I'm a little bit at a loss because it is so personal. What I will say, it's not necessarily a direct answer to your question, but in reporting a story that you are a character in, is a very complex role to play, and it really is a testament to Karen and to Gregory and to Marianne, and to Jess, if you're listening, Jess, if you're on this call, that I was able to hand over the most important thing in my life to them, and to feel that I was safe in doing that. And what that was able to do to me as a reporter was to remind me of something I knew, but I had never felt it before, was this is, as a reporter, is something that I do with the people I photograph every day, or, you know, when I'm working. And I could really feel what it was like to hand that over to somebody. And I need to remember as a reporter that people do that to me, and I need to really, really cherish that and take very, very good care of the subjects in my stories.
Great. So it turns out we do have some more questions. This one is from someone, I guess you know Sebastian, Suzanne Bott, but she is addressing this to all of you. How do you feel you will have closure? And do any of you have PTSD, guilt, or moral injury?
Yes? Just joking.
The end.
I'm not sure if I'll ever have closure, and that's the thing with ambiguous loss, is that you don't necessarily ever have closure. What you need to do is you need to find some sort of meaning in the ambiguity, and you can go in a lot of different directions with that. You can go down the Keats negative capability route. You could go more psychotherapeutic route. But for me, making this story, also making my book, those were ways in which I gave meaning to this experience.
Karen or Gregory, you want to add anything?
I wouldn't say, I mean, obviously I didn't experience the things, so I definitely don't have PTSD about this particular story, but I did. And I don't know if I have guilt about it, but it was a really hard story to let go of when I was done, actually. I was staying in a cabin right after the story was over, and I made a little grave memorial for him on this mountain where I was staying. But to Sebastian's point of handing over a story like this, I felt an immense, like, this is way too strong of a word, but it felt sacred to be trusted with a story like this about someone who isn't alive to tell their own story. And also because, yeah. So for me, it's probably this sounds so silly because like I don't know him and it didn't impact me personally, but it was one of the hardest stories to like be done with and move on.
So Gregory, I'm gonna combine the last couple of questions here and toss them to you. About rough translation, what kinds of stories are you particularly interested in or want more of? And what's the typical time frame or turnaround time for a rough translation story?
So we've changed a little bit. Well, actually, we've pivoted quite a lot in the current pandemic. We've been doing shorter pieces, which have a much faster turnaround. I would say fast for us means, well, I mean, we've done a story in 2 days. That was pretty fast for us. And so right now, I mean, it's interesting because the thesis of the show has begun with this idea that we that what's happening overseas can speak to us here at home. It's not so exotic. It's not so different, that there are lessons to be learned. We're all experiencing things which are similar and yet very differently. And yet now, literally, the coronavirus is a global thing that we are all experiencing and reacting to very differently. So it's bearing out the thesis of the show, and so we're leaning into that moment. And then more recently, just the way in which the protests, the Black Lives Matter movement and protests over George Floyd's death have resonated around the world, and the conversations there have been not just about, oh, we're looking at the US, but we're also looking here at home. This means something very different around the world. So both of these very big stories are very rough translation stories, in the sense that traveling around the world gives us perspective, not just on that place, but on this thing that we're all experiencing. In terms of asking for pitches and stories, I mean, I think that the show I was an overseas correspondent, and I think that the premise of it is that you can't come up with stories just sitting in your cubicle in New York or DC. So, I mean, I would say that the basic premise of the show is still, even in this time of lockdown, being there and trying to sort of experience the world, and running up against something that you just can't quite translate, or isn't what you quite expected. But characters who are overseas who we don't expect to hear from as well.
Can I say one thing about working with rough translation? I was a freelancer for the first several years of my career, and I've only ever done long form narrative, and it's a strange thing to hand off your story to somebody. But if you're thinking of pitching them, I would say, and I would say this if Gregory was not on the call, but Gregory and Marianne are some of the best listeners as editors that I've ever worked with, which is huge. They take a lot of time and effort and care to really hear what your version of the story is. And as obsessed as you are with the story, they get equally obsessed with it in a way that's really gratifying. So if you're thinking of pitching rough translation, I'm just saying you should. I'm really grateful that this particular story ended up with them.
Great. Well, thank you, all three.
And I think this seems,
yeah, the moment. Okay, so thanks to Gregory and Karen and Sebastian for sharing your thoughts with us and for doing this really powerful story. And thank you to OPC for organizing this. Patricia?
yeah, thank you, Anne. And thank you, Sebastian, Greg, and Karen, for speaking so personally about everything you dealt with, and also giving our listeners a lot of information about how you did the story and the questions that you had to deal with, and how to pitch rough translation. So it was really a fascinating hour, and so the Overseas Press Club is very grateful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.